My mother tried to destroy my garden to build a home for her dog. When I tried to stop her, she slapped me and told me to leave. She stood there in her designer scarf, clutching the dog as if he were the only legitimate heir to the family name. "This isn't your house anymore, Rebecca," she snarled, her voice ice cold and devoid of any maternal warmth. She thought she had won. She thought that by slapping me and throwing me out, I would be broken, penniless, and forgotten. But as I turned away, wiping the blood from my lip, I wasn't crying because I was weak. I was crying because of the secret I had been keeping for 3 years, a secret that was about to turn her entire world upside down. Hello. My name is Rebecca. I'm 30 years old, and for the last 3 decades, I've been a ghost in my own family. I've lived here in Portland trying to be the perfect daughter for a woman who only ever cared about her own reflection and the animals she treated better than her own flesh and blood. I thought that if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, maybe she would finally see me. But after that slap, the mask finally fell off. Before I tell you exactly how I turned my mother's betrayal into her ultimate downfall, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me share these stories of justice with all of you, and I'd love to hear from you today. Tell me where you're watching from right now and what time it is in your city. I read every single comment, and your support is what keeps me going. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let me show you what life was really like inside that house before the bulldozer showed up. Let me tell you about the years of being a second-class citizen to a dog and the moment I discovered that the mother who called me worthless had been living a lie that was about to cost her every single thing she loved. This isn't just a story about a destroyed garden. This is a story about a reckoning that no one, especially not my mother, saw coming. To understand why a garden could be worth a war, you have to understand the hierarchy of the house I grew up in. In the Everett household, there were 3 levels of importance. At the very top sat Beatrice, my mother, draped in silk and entitlement. Just below her, reclining on a velvet throne that cost more than my first car, was Bobby, a French bulldog with a pedigree longer than our family tree and a temperament that would make a spoiled toddler look like a saint. And then, at the very bottom, somewhere between the lint in the dryer and the weeds in the driveway, was me. I realized I was second class before I hit puberty. I remember my 10th birthday specifically. I had spent weeks talking about a science kit I wanted, the kind with the real microscope and the slides you could prepare yourself. I wanted to see the world up close, to find the hidden patterns in things. On the morning of my birthday, my mother walked into the kitchen with a huge ribbon-wrapped box. My heart nearly hammered out of my chest, but as I reached for it, she pulled it back. "Oh, no, Rebecca, this isn't for you," she said, her voice light and airy, as if she wasn't currently shattering my world. "This is his new orthopedic memory foam mattress. Happy birthday, though. There's some cereal in the cupboard." That was the pattern. If I needed new shoes for school because my toes were literally curling against the leather, it was not in the budget. But if Bobby needed a custom-made raincoat with reflective piping for his 3-minute walk to the mailbox, the credit card came out before he could even bark. I spent my teenage years in hand-me-downs from the local thrift shop, stitching the hems myself until I looked like a walking quilt, while my mother spent hundreds of dollars on organic, human-grade Wagyu beef for a dog that spent most of his day licking the floor. People always asked me, "Rebecca, why didn't you just leave? Or why didn't your father do anything?" My father, Thomas, was a gentleman, a carpenter by trade and a peacemaker by nature. He saw what was happening, and he tried to compensate in the only way he knew how. He couldn't win an argument against my mother. No one could. Beatrice had a way of turning every conversation into a trial where she was the judge and the victim. So my father built me a sanctuary. Behind our house in Portland, there was a patch of land that was nothing but gray dirt and rocks. One spring, when I was 12, he handed me a shovel. "Let's build something that's just ours, Becky," he whispered. Over the next 15 years, that dirt became a masterpiece. He taught me about soil acidity, about the patience of perennials, and the precise moment a hydrangea blooms into that deep, impossible blue. That garden wasn't just a collection of plants. It was the only place in the world where I wasn't the daughter who cost too much. It was the place where my father and I existed without the shadow of my mother's narcissism or Bobby's constant demanding presence. When my father passed away 3 years ago, the garden became my lifeline. Every time I pruned the roses or watered the ferns, I could still feel the callus of his hand on mine guiding the shears. It was the last piece of him I had left. My mother knew this. She saw me out there every morning before work, finding peace in the dirt, and because she couldn't control that peace, she hated it. She'd stand on the back porch clutching Bobby and sneer at the flower beds. "You're wasting your life in that mud, Rebecca. You could be inside brushing Bobby's coat or cleaning the baseboards. You're so selfish, always thinking about what you want to grow." I stayed because after my father died, she convinced me she was fragile. She played the grieving widow card until it was dog-eared and frayed. I paid the mortgage, I paid the utilities, I paid for the premium dog insurance that covered Bobby's weekly therapy sessions. Yes, the dog had a therapist. I thought I was being a good daughter. I thought I was protecting the woman who raised me. But the truth is, I was just a tenant in a house I was funding, waiting for the day she'd decide that the dog needed my space more than I did. I never imagined she would actually go through with it. I never thought she'd look at the only thing keeping my daughter's heart whole and decide it was the perfect spot for a kennel. But as I've learned the hard way, when you've spent 30 years treating a dog like a god and a child like a servant, you lose the ability to see the difference between a flower and a weed. And to her, I was always the weed. If you asked my mother where she was from, she wouldn't give you the address of the modest suburban house I was currently paying for. Instead, her eyes would glaze over with a look of practiced longing, and she would whisper 2 words as if they were a prayer: the Willow. The Willow Estate was a breathtaking historical farmhouse on the outskirts of Portland, a white colonial masterpiece surrounded by weeping willow trees that dipped their branches into a private pond. It was the kind of place you see on postcards or in movies where the family is always happy and the sun never stops shining. My mother had worked there as a social secretary for the previous owners when she was in her 20s, before she met my father. In her mind, those few years weren't just a job, they were a birthright that had been cruelly snatched away from her. She didn't just admire the house, she worshipped it. She kept a framed architectural sketch of it on her nightstand, right next to a photo of Bobby in his graduation cap. "That is where I belong, Rebecca," she'd say, staring at the sketch while I was scrubbing the kitchen floor. "A woman of my taste, my elegance. I was made for the halls of the Willow, not this cramped, drafty box you've trapped me in." The cramped box she was referring to was a beautiful 4-bedroom home with a wraparound porch and the garden I had spent half my life tending. But more importantly, it was a house that was running entirely on my sweat and exhaustion. This was the part of our life that no one saw. To the neighbors, Beatrice was the refined widow living gracefully with her devoted daughter. To her church friends, she was the saint who stayed behind to guide her difficult child. But behind closed doors, I was the silent engine keeping her fantasy alive. I worked 60 hours a week as a senior medical biller, a job that was as soul-crushing as it was lucrative. Every single cent of my paycheck, minus the bare essentials for my own survival, went into the household account. I paid for the organic groceries she insisted upon. I paid for the high-end dog groomers who visited twice a month to give Bobby a blueberry facial. I paid the property taxes, the heating bills, and the maintenance. And yet, every time I tried to mention the budget, every time I suggested that maybe we didn't need a $300 crystal vase for the hallway, she would use her skeleton key. She would clutch her chest, her eyes welling up with instant cinematic tears. "After everything I sacrificed as a mother, after the years I spent raising you when I could have been living my own life, you're going to count pennies with me now? You're going to be that ungrateful?" It worked every time. That guilt was a leash tighter than anything Bobby ever wore. She had convinced me that I was bad with money, a narrative she pushed so hard that I eventually started believing it myself. "You're a dreamer, Rebecca, not a doer. If I managed the finances, we'd be on the street within a month. You spend money like water on those useless flowers in the backyard." I used to apologize. I used to feel ashamed for buying a new pair of nursing scrubs or a book I wanted to read.
I lived like a tenant in my own life, eating leftovers at the kitchen counter while she served Bobby a seared steak at the dining table, all the while listening to her drone on about how one day she would find a way back to the Willow. She treated that estate like a lost kingdom, and me like the servant who was standing in the way of her return. She didn't realize that the only reason she had a roof over her head at all was because of the daughter she treated as an inconvenience. But her obsession with the Willow was more than just a dream, it was a sickness. And as I would soon find out, she was willing to burn down the only real sanctuary I had left, my father's garden, just to feel like she was finally the master of her own domain, even if that domain was just a palace for a dog. I pulled onto our quiet, tree-lined street in Portland after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. My back ached, my head was throbbing from the fluorescent lights, and all I wanted, the only thing that had kept me going through the endless paperwork and patient complaints, was the thought of sitting on the cedar bench my father had built me in the middle of our garden. I wanted to smell the damp earth and see if the blue hydrangeas had finally opened. But as I rounded the corner, the first thing I heard wasn't the wind through the pines. It was the rhythmic, metallic thud, thud, thud of a jackhammer. My heart didn't just drop, it stopped. I slammed the car into park, barely turning off the ignition before I was out the door. The air smelled like diesel fumes and pulverized stone. I ran toward the backyard, my scrubs catching on the gate, and what I saw destroyed the last shred of sanity I was holding on to. The secret sanctuary was gone. The cedar bench was a pile of splintered wood in the corner of the yard. The roses my father had spent a decade crossbreeding were nothing but tangled, thorny corpses under the treads of a mini excavator. A crew of 3 men was currently tearing up the soil where I had scattered some of my father's ashes. And there, standing on the back porch with a clipboard in one hand and Bobby tucked under her other arm, was my mother. She looked like she was overseeing the construction of a skyscraper, not the desecration of a daughter's soul. "Stop! Everyone stop right now!" I screamed. My voice didn't even sound like mine. It was a raw, jagged sound that tore through my throat. The machine operator looked up, confused, but my mother didn't even flinch. She adjusted her sunglasses and stepped down into the mud, her expensive boots clicking against a stone that used to be part of my father's rock garden. "Don't be dramatic, Rebecca," she said, her voice as casual as if she were commenting on the weather. "The workers have a schedule to keep. We're on a deadline." A deadline for what? I was shaking so hard I had to grab the fence to stay upright. "You're destroying it. You're destroying the only thing he left me. Why? Why would you do this?" She let out a short, sharp laugh and gestured to the empty, muddy crater that used to be my life's work. "Look at this space, Rebecca. It was a mess. Weeds, dirt, and those hideous blue flowers that attracted every bee in the county. It was a waste. Bobby hasn't been himself lately. His therapist says he needs a dedicated outdoor space, a villa, something climate-controlled where he can enjoy the fresh air without getting his paws soiled." She held up the clipboard, showing me a set of professional architectural blueprints. My eyes blurred as I looked at them.
It wasn't just a doghouse. It was a 10 by 12 mini mansion, complete with vaulted ceilings, a miniature porch, and a dedicated HVAC system. The Bobby Villa, the header read in gold embossed letters. "You spent the house maintenance fund on a doghouse?" I whispered. "That money was for the leaking roof and the water heater. You're using my money to build a palace for a dog over my father's grave?" Her face went from casual to lethal in a split second. The mask of the grieving, allegiant widow vanished, and the predator underneath emerged. "Your money?" she hissed, stepping into my personal space. "Everything in this house belongs to me. I carried you for 9 months. I gave up my dreams of living at the Willow to raise a child who was never grateful, and you think you can tell me how to manage my property?" "It's not just about the money, Mom. It's the garden. Dad and I, we built this. This was his last gift to me. How can you be so cruel?" I lunged past her, trying to grab the shovel from one of the workers, desperate to save at least one of the rose bushes that was currently being buried under a pile of gravel. I was crying now, the kind of heavy, ugly sobs that come from a place of total betrayal. I said, "Stop," I yelled at the operator. Suddenly, the world went sideways. Crack. The sound was like a gunshot. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side, and for a second, all I saw was white static. The heat on my cheek was instantaneous, a searing, throbbing pain that made my ears ring. I stumbled back, my boots slipping in the mud, and looked at my mother. She wasn't even shaking. She was standing there, her hand still raised, her eyes filled with a terrifying kind of triumph. "I told you to learn your place," she said, her voice low and steady. "I am the head of this household. I am the owner of this land. And if you ever embarrass me in front of my employees again, you'll find out exactly how cold the streets of Portland are." The three construction workers looked away, suddenly very interested in their boots. The silence that followed was heavier than the diesel smoke. "You slapped me?" I whispered, my hand going to my face. "For a doghouse. You chose a doghouse over your own daughter." "I chose my peace over your insolence," she replied, turning her back on me. She walked over to the foreman and tapped the blueprints. "Continue. I want the foundation poured by sunset. And Rebecca," she didn't even turn around to look at me, "pack a bag. I'm done with your face, I'm done with your attitude. You have until tonight to get your things and get out of my house. Since you're so good with money and so independent, I'm sure you'll find a new place to stay, but you're not spending another night under my roof." I stood there in the mud, in my work scrubs, with the imprint of her fingers darkening on my skin. I looked at the splintered cedar of my father's bench and the gray concrete that was already being mixed to cover his legacy. "You're making a mistake, Mom," I said, my voice finally becoming quiet, deathly quiet. "The only mistake I made was not doing this 10 years ago," she snapped. "Now go, before I call the police and have you escorted off for trespassing." She thought she had evicted me. She thought she had won. But as I walked toward the front door to gather the few things I actually cared about, I wasn't thinking about where I would sleep that night. I was thinking about the phone call I had made to a forensic accountant 3 months ago. I was thinking about the bank records she thought I never saw. And most of all, I was thinking about the Willow, the house she loved more than anything. She wanted me out of her house? Fine, but I was going to make sure that by the time I was done, she wouldn't have a house to call hers. I didn't go to a hotel that night. I didn't go to a shelter, and I didn't sit on a park bench waiting for the sun to rise. Instead, I drove 3 blocks away, pulled into a dark parking lot, and sat there until my hands stopped shaking enough to hold my phone. I called the only person I knew who understood the language of numbers better than the language of emotions, my college friend, Mark. Mark was a forensic accountant, the kind of guy who looked at a spreadsheet and saw a crime scene. We met at a 24-hour diner, the smell of burnt coffee and grease filling the air as I sat across from him, the bruise on my cheek now a deep, angry purple. I didn't tell him about the slap at first. I just handed him the box of bank statements I'd been quietly collecting for months. "Mark, my mother says I'm bad with money," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "She says I'm ungrateful and that I'm lucky to have a roof over my head. But the math? It doesn't add up. I pay every bill, yet the accounts are always empty." Mark didn't say a word. He just opened his laptop, adjusted his glasses, and started to work. For 3 hours, the only sound was the clicking of keys and the distant hum of the freeway. I watched his face transition from professional curiosity to absolute cold fury. "Rebecca," he finally said, turning the screen toward me, "your mother isn't just a bad manager of money, she's a professional predator." He pointed to a series of transactions dating back 10 years. "Look at this. Your father, Thomas, he didn't just leave you memories, he left you a life insurance policy worth $400,000. It was supposed to be a trust fund that matured when you were 25, but the administrator of that trust was Beatrice." My stomach did a slow, sickening roll.
She told me he died in debt. She told me we almost lost the house because of his medical bills. He didn't have medical bills, Mark said, his voice flat and hard. And it gets worse. This house you're living in, the one she just evicted you from, she didn't buy it with her savings. She bought it with your trust fund. And because you were a minor when the papers were signed, she put the deed in her name for your protection. But she's been using your social security number to open at least 3 other joint credit cards you never authorized. She's been draining your paychecks into an offshore savings account while telling you the mortgage was behind. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I thought back to the years of eating rice, the broken zippers on my coats, and the way she made me feel like a burden for wanting a new pair of shoes. It wasn't because we were poor, it was because she was stealing my air while I was still trying to breathe. But then Mark's eyes lit up with a different kind of intensity. And here is the piece of the puzzle she didn't expect anyone to find.
You know that place she's obsessed with, the Willow Estate? I nodded. She talks about it every single day. It's her holy grail. Well, the holy grail just hit the market, Mark said, leaning back. The previous owners went into foreclosure. It's going up for a private auction in 72 hours. But here's the kicker. Beatrice doesn't have the cash to buy it. She spent everything on that dog villa and her own luxury habits. She was planning to use this current house, your house, as collateral to get a loan for a down payment. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me. All the pieces fell into place. The destruction of the garden wasn't just about the dog, it was about clearing the property to increase the value for an appraisal. She was going to sell my father's legacy and my future to buy her own fantasy, and she was going to throw me into the street to do it. She thinks she's a queen, I said, looking at the numbers on the screen. She thinks she can just erase me and move into her palace. She can't, not if we file an emergency injunction for financial exploitation. We have the evidence, Rebecca. We have the forged signatures on the trust withdrawals. We have the proof of the stolen insurance money. We could have her arrested by Friday. No, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in years. Arresting her is too easy. She wants to live in the Willow. She wants to be the lady of the manor. Let's help her realize that dream, but let's make sure she realizes it on my terms. I looked at the total balance of the offshore account Mark had found. It was enough. It was more than enough. Mark, I said, my voice steady and cold, how fast can you get me the paperwork to buy a house in secret? I want to buy the Willow. I want to buy every single brick and willow tree on that property, and I want to do it before she even knows I have a cent to my name. She thought she had taken my garden. She thought she had taken my home, but she was about to find out that the daughter she called worthless was the only person who held the deed to her future. The hunt was on, and for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't the prey. Sitting in a cramped, fluorescent-lit motel room on the edge of Portland, the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cleaner clinging to the walls, I should have felt defeated. I had a purple bruise on my face, a suitcase full of wrinkled scrubs, and no home to return to. But as I looked at the legal documents Mark had sent over to my laptop, I didn't feel like a victim. For the first time in my life, I felt like the architect of my own destiny. Beatrice thought she had evicted me into poverty, but she had actually evicted me into the truth, and the truth was a powerful, expensive weapon. The auction for the Willow starts in 48 hours, Rebecca. Mark's voice crackled over the phone. He was working from his office, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his desk. It's a private sale. Because of the foreclosure, the bank wants a quick exit. They're looking for a cash buyer who can close within 7 days. Your mother has been trying to secure a bridge loan using your current house as collateral, but because I flagged the trust fund for suspected unauthorized activity, the bank put a freeze on any new liens. She's stuck. She has the desire, but she doesn't have the liquid capital. I leaned back against the thin, lumpy pillow of the motel room bed. I had exactly what she took, Mark said, his tone turning professional. The $400,000 from the life insurance, plus the accrued interest, plus the unauthorized withdrawals we can legally claw back. It's sitting in an escrow account now, waiting for a judge's signature, but I can use the proof of that asset to secure a pre-approval for the auction. Rebecca, you're not just a bidder, you're the strongest buyer in the room.
A cold, sharp thrill ran through me. My mother had spent 30 years looking at the sketch of the willow, dreaming of the day she would walk through those white columns as the owner. She had sacrificed my childhood, my father's garden, and my dignity at the altar of that house. She thought she was the only one worthy of it. She thought I was just the help that paid the bills. Do it, I told him. Enter the bid. I want that house, Mark. Not because I want to live in luxury, but because I want to own the only thing she ever truly loved. The next 2 days were a blur of adrenaline and agonizing silence. I kept going to my shifts at the hospital, moving like a ghost through the corridors. Every time a patient asked me what happened to my face, I'd just smile and say, I'm just doing some long overdue landscaping. They didn't know I was talking about my life. Meanwhile, my mother was busy. I checked her social media. She couldn't help herself. She posted a photo of the Dog Villa Foundation being poured over my ruined hydrangeas. The caption read, "Out with the weeds and in with royalty. Bobby deserves a palace, and finally there's no one left to complain about the cost. Hashtag new beginnings. Hashtag dog mom. Hashtag living my best life." I stared at that photo for a long time. She was so proud of herself. She was so convinced that by removing me, she had removed the only obstacle to her happiness. She didn't realize that by destroying that garden, she had removed the only thing that was keeping me from fighting back. The morning of the auction, I sat in Mark's office. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and old paper. We were participating via a secure online portal. The starting bid was high, but as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the pool of buyers was small. One developer wanted it for a boutique hotel, another wanted it for a private winery. Then a new bidder entered the fray. The name on the screen was masked, but Mark tracked the source. "It's her," he whispered. "She's using a high-interest private lender. She's desperate. She's betting money she doesn't even have yet, betting on the sale of your house to cover it." My mother was gambling her entire existence on a dream she had already stolen from me. "Raise it," I said, my voice steady. Every time she bid, I went higher. 10,000, 20,000. I watched the numbers climb, imagining her sitting in our living room clutching Bobby, her hand shaking as she clicked the button, convinced that her destiny was just one more bid away. Then came the final jump. I put down a number that was exactly the amount of my stolen trust fund. It was the ultimate irony. I was buying her dream house with the very money she had bled from my father's death. The screen went still.
The timer ticked down. Going once, going twice, sold. The confirmation email popped up on Mark's screen. "Congratulations, Rebecca Everett. You are the new owner of the Willow Estate." I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just took a deep breath of the first clean air I'd breathed in 3 decades. "Now what?" Mark asked, looking at me with a mix of awe and concern. "Now," I said, standing up and smoothing out my scrubs, "we wait for her house to go into foreclosure. We wait for her to realize that the palace she'd built for her dog is sitting on land she no longer owns. And then I'm going to invite her to lunch at my new home." She wanted me to leave? Fine. I was gone, but I was coming back as the one thing she never expected me to be, her landlord. The fall of Beatrice Everett wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow, agonizing crumble, much like the garden she had so carelessly destroyed. Within 3 weeks of my eviction, the financial house of cards she had built began to fold. Without my paycheck to cover the mortgage, the property taxes, and the exorbitant heating bills for her dog villa, the bank moved with a speed that even surprised Mark. Because the house had been used as collateral for her failed bridge loan to buy the Willow, the foreclosure was swift and merciless. I sat in my car across the street on the morning the moving trucks arrived, not hers, but the bank's. I watched through the rain-streaked windshield as the men in neon vests hauled out the velvet dog throne, the crystal vases, and the silk rugs. I saw the half-finished dog mansion in the backyard, now just a gray concrete tomb for my father's roses, surrounded by yellow caution tape. It looked pathetic. It looked like the monument to a woman who had traded a daughter's love for a patch of gravel. Then my phone buzzed. It was a number I had blocked, but she was calling from a burner, or perhaps a neighbor's phone. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. "Rebecca?" Her voice was a ragged, high-pitched mess. The elegant widow was gone. "Rebecca, honey, are you there? There's been a terrible mistake. The bank, they're here.
They're taking everything. I don't have anywhere to go. Bobby is stressed. He's shaking. He needs his specialized environment. I leaned back against the headrest, my voice as level as the Portland horizon. I saw the listing, Mom. I know the house is gone. It's that accountant friend of yours, isn't it? He did something to the accounts. You have to help me, Rebecca. After everything I did for you, you can't let your mother sleep in a motel. I'm your family. Blood is thicker than water, remember? It was the same script she'd used in every family dinner, every argument I'd tried to stand up for myself. Blood is thicker than water. She used that phrase like a leash to drag me back into her orbit whenever she needed something. But she forgot the rest of the proverb. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. My covenant was with the truth and with the father she had tried to erase. I'm actually in a new place now, Mom. It's a bit of a drive, but it's peaceful. Why don't you bring Bobby and come over for lunch? We can talk about your future. Oh, thank God. She let out a sob that sounded more like a sigh of relief that her meal ticket hadn't completely expired. I knew you'd come around. You always were the sensitive one. Just text me the address. I'll be there in an hour. I just need to pack Bobby's travel kit. I didn't text her the address. I texted her the coordinates to the front gate of the Willow estate. I arrived at the Willow 40 minutes before her. I stood under the massive white columns of the porch, looking out at the weeping willows that dipped their branches into the pond. The air here didn't smell like diesel or pulverized stone. It smelled like cedar and fresh water. It felt like the sanctuary my father always wanted for me. I had the deed in a manila folder on the hall table, and the keys, heavy brass keys, in my pocket. I watched her beat-up SUV crawl up the long, winding driveway. She drove slowly, her eyes wide as she took in the rolling green lawns and the historical architecture. I could see her through the windshield, clutching Bobby to her chest, her face pressed against the glass like a child at a candy store window. She pulled up to the front circle, her mouth hanging open. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the gravel, the same sound she'd made when she walked over my ruined hydrangeas. She didn't see me at first. She was too busy worshiping the house. "It's beautiful," she whispered to the empty air. "I knew I'd find my way back here. I always knew I was meant for this life." She started walking towards the front door, her posture straightening, that old sense of entitlement returning as if she were reclaiming a lost kingdom. She didn't even look towards the porch until I stepped out from behind one of the columns. "Rebecca," she stopped 10 feet away, her eyes darting between me and the house and back again. "What are you doing here? Did you get a job as a caretaker? Is that how you're staying here?" I didn't answer. I just pulled the brass key from my pocket and held it up. The sunlight caught the metal, making it glint like a star. "I bought it, Mom." The silence that followed was absolute. Bobby let out a small, pathetic whimper, but Beatrice was frozen. Her face went through a terrifying transformation, confusion, denial, and then a slow, agonizing realization. "You bought it? With what money? You don't have money. I managed your finances. You were bad with numbers." "I was never bad with numbers, Beatrice. I was just a victim of a thief. I found the trust fund. I found the life insurance. I found the 4 accounts you opened in my name. And I found the offshore savings you thought I'd never see. Every cent you used to bid on this house, that was my money. And when the bank froze your assets because of the fraud investigation, I used the actual capital to finish what you started." She lunged forward, her face twisted in a mask of rage. "That house is mine. I've dreamed of this for 30 years. You stole it from me. You manipulated the system to take my dream."
You didn't have a dream, Mom, I countered, my voice growing colder. You had an obsession. You destroyed my father's garden for a dog, and you slapped your daughter for a palace. You wanted to live in the Willow? Well, look around. You're standing on the property, but you're not the mistress of the manor. I opened the manila folder and held up the deed. The Willow estate belongs to Rebecca Everett, sole owner. And since you were so fond of telling me to get off your property 3 weeks ago, I think it's only fair that I return the favor." She started to cry then, real tears this time, the kind that come from losing a war you thought you were winning. She fell to her knees in the gravel, Bobby squirming in her arms. Rebecca, please, I'm your mother. You can't do this. I have nowhere else to go. Look at Bobby. He's cold. He's scared. I looked at the dog. I felt sorry for him. He was just an animal caught in a narcissist's web. But then I looked at my cheek in the reflection of her car window, remembering the sting of her hand. I looked at the memory of my father's ruined garden. You chose your peace over my insolence, remember? I said, repeating her words back to her. Well, I'm choosing my legacy over your greed. You wanted to live like royalty? Royalty doesn't beg, Beatrice. They accept their exile. I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy oak doors of my new home. I heard her screaming my name, the sound echoing through the willow trees, but for the first time in 30 years, the sound didn't make me flinch. I put the key in the lock, turned it, and stepped inside, closing the door on the woman who thought a daughter was a weed to be pulled. Watching Beatrice through the security camera feed as I sat in the grand library of the Willow, I didn't feel the surge of joy I thought I would. Instead, I felt a profound, quiet sense of relief. It was the feeling of a weight being lifted after 30 years of being crushed. She stayed at the gate for 3 hours, her screams eventually turning into desperate pleas, then into a hollow, defeated silence. The accountability was absolute. Because of the legal injunction Mark and I had filed, the bank didn't just take the house. They audited every single withdrawal she had made from my trust for the last decade. Every organic steak she bought for Bobby, every designer scarf, and every brick of that dog villa was cataloged as a misappropriation of funds. To avoid criminal charges for fiduciary fraud and perjury regarding the insurance payout, she had to sign over the remaining proceeds from the forced sale of her house directly into an account for the restoration of my father's legacy. She moved into a 400-square-foot apartment in a part of town she used to call the slums. There was no wraparound porch, no weeping willows, and certainly no climate-controlled mansion for Bobby. The dog who had been treated like a prince now had to learn to walk on cracked linoleum. A week later, she sent me a long, rambling email. She tried to use her skeleton key one last time. She claimed her heart was failing, that the stress of the misunderstanding was killing her, and that a mother's love should be enough to overlook a few financial mistakes. She even sent a photo of Bobby looking sad, hoping I'd cave for the animal if not for her. I didn't reply with anger. I replied with a single sentence. You chose your peace over my feelings for 30 years. Now I'm choosing the truth over your performance. I didn't forgive her, not because I'm cruel, but because forgiveness without accountability is just an invitation for more abuse. She didn't lose her home because of me. She lost it because she decided that a daughter was an expense and a dog was an investment. She lived in a world of her own making now, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't required to pay the rent for her illusions. Looking back, I realized that the garden was never just about flowers, and the house was never just about bricks. They were symbols of a much larger battle, the battle for my own worth. I spent 30 years believing that I was a secondary character in my own life, a tenant in a house I was funding, waiting for a mother's love that was always conditional. The day my mother slapped me in that muddy crater is the day I finally woke up. It was the moment I stopped asking for a seat at her table and decided to build my own manor. Today, as I walk through the halls of the Willow, I don't see a trophy of revenge. I see a testament to the truth. I see the legacy my father wanted for me, preserved in a place where no one can ever tear it down to build a palace for a pet. Family is supposed to be your sanctuary, but sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones most willing to spill it. If you're going through something similar, if you feel invisible or unloved by the people who are supposed to protect you, please know this: you are not a weed. You are the gardener of your own life. You have the power to uproot the toxicity and plant something beautiful in its place. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this journey. If this story meant something to you, or if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against all odds, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my position? Would you have bought the house or just walked away?
I can't wait to read your thoughts. There's another incredible story of justice and family secrets linked in the description below that I think you'll really connect with. Click it, and I'll see you over there.